Hey everyone, Dr. Lee Bryce here, and I am here for your week 3 video. So let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about section Sex and Sexualities, which is chapter 5 from your textbook. So I'm going to start with lecture on sex and sexualities, and then we're also going to do review, sort of going over the logistical aspects of your midterm exam, followed by the exit pass and reminders. So the first thing we need to do in order to talk about sex and sexualities is we got to go over the foundational terms related to sex, sexualities, and that sort of thing. So in your textbook, the authors talk about sexualities and sexual orientation, and they define a bunch of key terms. I find the gender unicorn figure pictured here on the slides to be a really good way to think through some of these terms that are being defined in your textbook. So, when we think about sexualities and sexual orientation, it's important to think about these terms and these ideas as non binary. So, already we've talked a little bit about gender and gender inequalities, right? That was last week, week 2, chapter 4 in the textbook. And we talked about how both sex and gender are social constructs and are often perceived in our society as binary, so there's only two options, but in reality, how gender and sex both exist on a spectrum. So the gender unicorn figure is taking that idea that sex and gender are socially constructed and that they exist on a spectrum and that they're non-binary. And it's sort of taking that and going a step further to think through, what does that mean for sexual attraction, for dating, for all these different things related to sexualities and sexual orientation. And so here you can see that there's all these arrows. These arrows are a way to demonstrate that these things exist on a spectrum and they're continuous. So it's really hard to think about identity categories and putting a label on things related to sexuality and sexual orientation once we understand that these things are socially constructed and they exist on a spectrum. And so you can see gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, who someone's physically attracted to, and who someone is emotionally attracted to. These things are all on a spectrum. They're not binary. There are not just two options, or sometimes we'll think of like having three options. So for example, with sex assigned at birth, we've gotten to a place in the United States and in a lot of Western countries where we now understand that there's male, female, and intersex. So there's a third option. It's important to note that a lot of non-Western societies have always had this understanding of a third option. However, when we start to understand that these things exist on a spectrum, we see that there's more than three options even, and that people can be in between and on this sort of scale on this arrow, right? Okay. Now, another important aspect of the gender unicorn figure is the fact that all of these things, there's this little dotted line. Oftentimes, there's this expectation that gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, physical and emotional attractiveness, that these things are somehow connected. And so if you're in this arrow here on gender identity, then you must be here in gender expression, and you must be here at sex assigned at birth, and then you must be here and here in terms of who you're emotionally and sexually attracted to. So these dotted lines are a way to tell us actually these different aspects of our identities don't necessarily have a connection. And so who your gender identity doesn't necessarily equate to expressing your gender in a particular way. And they can connect. Sometimes there's a correlation or a connection, but not always. And similarly, your sex assigned at birth, there can be a connection, but not always. And so I would say that increasingly, especially with social media and ideas around sex and sexuality going viral, these are things that people, young people especially, sort of understand in a lay way, like in a lay audience way. The thing that students we'll find most surprising nowadays, I think, is the fact that who you're physically and who you're emotionally attracted to, that those things are separate. And while they can be connected, they don't necessarily have to be connected. And so, as we start to think about the definitions that are being defined in the textbook in chapter 5, and we start to think about the social constructedness of these terms and how that relates to the gender unicorn figure, we also have to think about what this means for policy and inevitably social problems, right? So, there's this connection with social problems and policy and laws and things like that. And so, that's what is on the docket next. All right, so laws related to sexual behavior and sexual orientation have existed for such a long time. I believe the textbook authors start things off thinking about sodomy laws. So this idea that if you're having sex with someone who's the same gender as you, that is illegal. And of course, we had sodomy laws in the books in the United States for a very long time. If we think about the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s, we can think about the Stonewall riots. We can think about how the Stonewall riots happened, and there's been movies and documentaries made about that. So I feel like a lot of young people know what the Stonewall riots were. But essentially, there were LGBTQ plus bars where folks could go and be around other LGBTQ plus folks when it was still illegal to have sex with someone of the same gender. And the owners were paying off the police because it was illegal. These bars were illegal because of sodomy laws. And so there was sort of an uptick in police raids at LGBTQ plus bars, and people were getting arrested. And one of the things that police officers would do is they would look at people who were at these bars. They'd see what is their gender marker on their state ID, on their driver's license. And if they didn't have at least, depending on the state, 2 or 3 quote unquote gender appropriate pieces of clothing on at that time, then they were automatically taken to jail. They were put in the paddy wagon during these raids. And so the LGBTQ plus community got really frustrated at the increase in these raids, especially because they were literally paying cops off to not get raided, and it led to riots. And so there were some high profile queer folks who got upset, and they sort of resisted arrest, and it led to change and policy change. It led to the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement. And so eventually we start to see policy changes where LGBTQ plus folks have more rights. And so we can think about a lot of folks in the United States saw the passage of marriage equality as sort of the quote unquote end goal for LGBTQ plus civil rights. And we achieved that during Barack Obama's presidency. However, the reality is that there are still a lot of inequities that exist for the LGBTQ plus community. So just because people of the same gender can get married, it doesn't mean that there isn't discrimination in other ways. If we think about trans bathroom bills, if we think about some of the stuff happening in states like Tennessee right now related to drag performances and making those illegal, if there's any sort of law or policy in place that prevents people from expressing themselves, their gender expression, the way that they would like to, then those are still inherently anti-LGBTQ plus policies that exist in the United States. And so having same-sex marriage is not the end all be all in terms of LGBTQ plus civil rights and policy achievements. Especially we can start to think about what type of gay person does the passage of same-sex marriage privilege. Well, of course, wealthier gay folks are able to get married. They're able to pay the fees that are necessary to get your marriage certificate. They're probably going to spend money on having a wedding, right? But poor folks are still not having access to marriage, because even the act of paying to get your marriage certificate might be out of the realms of possibilities for poor folks, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. But definitely there's some inequalities when it comes to pay for the LGBTQ plus community. And so we can think about those laws, starting with sodomy laws and then going to more contemporary policy and law issues such as same-sex marriage or bathroom bills and things like that. And so this all relates to structural inequalities, which I introduced a lot of stuff related to structural inequalities last week when we talked about race and gender. And so we can start to think about, well, if within our social institutions, so within policy and laws, thinking about politics as a social institution, there are certain laws and policies in the books that disenfranchise the LGBTQ plus community. So that's sort of one way we can think about structural inequalities. We can also think about how those policies impact other social institutions. So again, thinking about bathroom laws, if trans folks and non-binary folks, people who exist on this spectrum and this spectrum, if they're unable to use a public restroom, let's say at their high school or their college or university, that's another way in which structural inequalities play out within education. And of course, we talked last week about how education is a social institution. And so we can think about those structural inequalities. Now, I'm sure you can think about many other social institutions and how policies and laws impact those social institutions, leading to further structural inequalities for the LGBTQ plus community. All right, now I touched on this question, this next bullet point. What about current policies related to sexualities? Certainly, we can think about some other issues. We can think about being a member of the LGBTQ plus community and the evolution of policy related to serving in the United States military, right? So we had Don't Ask, Don't Tell for a really long time. And that was seen as an achievement because prior to that, you would get dishonorably discharged if it was found out that you identified as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And then eventually we got to a place where now people don't have to hide their LGBTQ plus identity and they can openly serve as an out member of the LGBTQ plus community. Although we can also think about how there's likely a lot of bullying and retaliation that happens for folks who are out. And, so we can think about formal policies and laws that disenfranchise the LGBTQ plus community versus informal ways in which people can experience retaliation and bullying for their identities. Another topic that comes up when we think about sex and sexualities in Chapter 5 is sex work. And so we can think about prostitution. In some Western countries, prostitution is legal. And even within the United States, prostitution is legal in Las Vegas. And so there's legal brothels there. And so this is often perceived as a taboo topic, but we can start to think about what are the implications of legalizing prostitution and sex work? And we can think about in Las Vegas, for example, the legal brothels there, they operate arguably in a more safe environment where the women who are engaging in sex work, they have more autonomy, more access to their money, more autonomy in terms of what they're willing to do and what they're not willing to do for clients. They also typically get tested regularly for STIs. And so there's a level of safety when we think about the legalization of sex work. Versus if we think about prostitution in places where it's illegal, oftentimes women have less agency when they're deciding what they are or are not willing to do for clients. Typically, there's a pimp who's a man who's in charge of money and decision-making and that sort of thing on behalf of sex workers. And then we can also think about the level of safety and the spread of STIs because it's really hard to get tested regularly when your profession is illegal. All right. And so, and we can also, there's some privilege happening there as well, where we think about the most vulnerable sex workers who are poor, who are often part of the LGBTQ plus community. So trans women of color being the most vulnerable when it comes to sex workers. And now they're more likely to be incarcerated for sex-related offenses versus women who are cis. White women are more likely to engage in sex work that's higher end. So if you think about escort services and things like that, that means that they're less likely to get arrested and put in jail for engaging in sex work. And so we can start to think about policy and where these sex acts are occurring. Is it happening in public or is it happening in private? And we can start to think about how socioeconomic status and privilege operates in all these different ways. All right. Finally, why and how have norms and social attitudes towards sexualities and sexual orientation changed over time in the United States? I touched a little bit about this when I went over briefly the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement. And so when we have a social movement, that leads to changes in attitude for the general public. Another important aspect of changing attitudes toward any historically marginalized group of people is policy changes. So as we see policy changes, things like same-sex marriage, for example, that helps to normalize the experiences of the LGBTQ plus community, which in turn leads to more positive attitude changes toward that community. When we start to legalize the experiences of LGBTQ plus folks, then people feel more comfortable coming out to non-LGBTQ plus colleagues and friends and family members. And so if you know someone who identifies as part of the LGBTQ plus community and they're out to you, then it normalizes those experiences and folks start to have more positive attitudes and beliefs around LGBTQ plus civil rights. And that's true, again, of pretty much any historically marginalized community. Being able to humanize the experiences of people who are different than you, knowing their experiences and their hardships, really helps to normalize and have more positive attitudes. However, the last thing I want to talk about on this slide, and your textbook authors go into greater detail on this, is we do start to see backlash. So when a particular civil rights movement has success, in this case, the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement, we also see a backlash. So if we think again about same-sex marriage passing nationally in the United States, that was seen as a huge achievement for the gay community. And yet since then, we've seen a backlash and more conservative policy related to the LGBTQ plus community, or more informal retaliation for folks who are out. So an increase in hate crimes, for example, for gay couples who are out, who are married, and that sort of thing. So the policy is there, but when there's a backlash because of a civil rights movement, we're going to see how that plays out in sort of violent ways sometimes. And so we can start to think about the political implications and how those related to LGBTQ plus civil rights and how that leads to social problems, including an uptick in violence toward the LGBTQ plus community as part of this backlash movement. And we can start to see how even as one policy passes, one law passes, like same-sex marriage, there's a plethora of other LGBTQ plus related policies and laws that start to be discussed that proliferate and lead to further social problems related to the LGBTQ plus community. All right, so that was a lot of information thrown at you all at once. Be sure to read chapter 5 and take notes when it comes to all of the foundational terms for that chapter. And now I want to transition into our review section for the midterm exam. So I emailed everyone the study guide at the beginning of week 2. That's available for you. Make sure you're familiar with all key terms, all theories, all methodologies discussed in the textbook, chapters 1 through 5. Anything from PowerPoints and lecture videos is fair game as well. You should also be familiar with all of the policies and procedures that are in the syllabus. There are details for the midterm exam in your syllabus, which I'll show you in just a second. But let's go over the rest of this first. So there's going to be 50 questions because the exam is worth 50 points, and you have 50 minutes to complete the exam. Questions will be true, false, multiple choice. There will likely also be some matching questions and maybe 1 or 2 short responses, but there will not be an essay component. You'll take the exam online. It'll be set up through Moodle. You only get 1 attempt. This is important to note because if you have any Wi-Fi or tech issues with Moodle, you'll want to contact me as soon as possible because we'll need to address that and then reopen everything on your end once we've finished troubleshooting everything with Moodle ITS. Now you need to finish your midterm exam by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, week 3. This means you're not starting the exam at that time. So think about the fact that you have 50 minutes. You don't want to start the exam at 11:30 p.m. because you're going to get cut off without utilizing your full 50 minutes. So just be mindful of all of these things. Of course, next week, should you have any questions about the study guide or about logistics related to the midterm exam, I'm happy to answer emails or meet with you in real time via Zoom. All right. Now, the last thing I want to show students is if you go to Moodle, and you go to week 3, this is where your midterm link will be. So once the midterm has gone live and it's available to students, I will email the entire class to let you know. And then you'll have until, again, it cuts off at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. So you'll click the link here and it'll begin. But in terms of preparing, I did email the entire class with your study guide, but it's also available here. This is what it looks like. And so you can see where you'll go through and you'll define all of the key terms. And then if you have any further questions, I think everyone knows where the syllabus is located because everyone should have submitted the syllabus agreement at this point. But just in case, here it is. You can download it. You'll see how many points the midterm is worth, and you will see details here about the midterm exam. All right, so I think that covers all the logistics. Again, if you have any questions that are more content specific, email me or schedule a Zoom. Here's your exit pass link. And this, just as a reminder, you should be reading chapter 5 in the textbook. If you're behind on the readings, make sure you've read chapters 1 through 5 before starting the midterm exam. You should also complete discussion board 3 this week. You're submitting your weekly reading notes for week 3 as well. And then, of course, you're completing your midterm exam. All right, that's all I have for you. Have a great week. I hope everyone gets an A++ on your midterm exam, and I will be making another video shortly for week 4. Bye, everyone.